Greetings from Stanford University. I'm Bill Barnett, professor at the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability and the Stanford Graduate School of Business.
And I'm Charlotte Kramer, a current undergraduate here at Stanford.
And we have with us today in the studio Professor Patricia Bromley. Tricia, you've just run a conference on civil society and sustainability. Charlotte, just looking at these different papers that were presented at the conference, what catches your eye?
As a third culture kid, sort of growing up in a country that my parents aren't from and then moving to a whole different country for my higher education, I'm always really interested when someone mentions world society. I've visited 99 countries in my lifetime. I feel
Holy
like
Moses.
Wow.
99, listeners. I don't know how many countries you'd been to by the time you were a sophomore. Is that right? Yeah. Okay. 99 countries. Sorry. What were you saying?
Well, I feel that I have a pretty good understanding of what the world means. So when you say sustainability in world society, what kind of themes do you see in that? I see papers such as higher education and global sustainability. That to me is super relevant. I mean, here I am in higher education studying global sustainability. So I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for asking that great question. There's so much in it. I don't know which direction to go exactly, but maybe I'll start with the higher education angle, which you picked up. So a main focus that came up in the conference was the underemphasized role of education, and especially higher education, in thinking about sustainability outcomes and environmental outcomes more generally. And this is certainly a feature we see at Stanford, transitions in the university and the course offerings and the new school, but it's happening worldwide. So that's one key theme. The deeper question behind what is world society, another way to think about it is related to a lot of things we hear about in the news these days about the liberal world order. So a whole interconnected set of themes about democracy, higher education, civic rights, various kinds of women's rights, and how these types of trends are linked to sustainability themes.
I also wonder, we use the terminology global north, global south a lot. How do you think that comes into play when discussing world society, also through this civil lens?
Yeah, a big feature that shows up in that kind of dichotomy is that it's not very helpful, first of all, for thinking about solving some of these issues. One part of it is that what to use that phrase, global north, it's often a set of sort of widely accepted assumptions about how the world should work that are not equally accepted all the way around the world, and sometimes interfere with our understanding of what appropriate responses might be in local settings in other places. So
that's interesting. Do you have an example of this, Tricia?
Sure. So we had a wonderful speaker, Kanari Webb, who's the founder and former executive director of an organization called Health in Harmony. She's a medical doctor and went to Indonesia to help with health outcomes in local communities with the idea of sort of working to improve community health. When she got there, she saw the community was cutting down the rainforest that they live near. And she tells, in her words, feeling outraged by this. How could they be cutting down the rainforest? Orangutans live there. This is horrible. From the kind of Western lens, it makes sense to feel that way. But after she had spent months living in the community, she realized the reason they were cutting down the rainforest was to gain income to pay for health services. So if there were ways of listening to the community and really understanding what the problem was, it could sort of solve both issues. So the issue was resources to provide for healthcare.
That's interesting. That's very interesting.
But then who do you believe is responsible for that issue? Is it civil society? Is it the government? To what extent can we even trust governments to do, the right thing, so to say, for their people, by their people?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's another theme that came up across the conference is it's one that's increasingly difficult to answer. So it used to be the case that the taken for granted idea of civil society were that these were public good actors, and you could probably trust them and perhaps them working with and on behalf of government sometimes to be working on behalf of the public good. But as the world shifts, again, this change in the liberal world order, say, that's less obviously the case. We see lots of organizations and governments working on both sides of issues in a way that seems much more complicated than it used to be. So it's great, and we should be asking these kinds of questions even more now than we used to.
You know, Tricia, a couple of times you've used this phrase, the liberal world order.
Mm-hmm.
What is that?
So the way it gets used is this idea that sort of after World War II, especially, there was a kind of closer than we've ever had, global consensus about a set of norms rooted in the idea of individual human rights and individual capacities. And this is the foundation of why we have democracies and markets as kind of ideal types of the foundational social structures in many societies, based on individual choice and decision and individual rights as the underpinning principles. This is the core of liberalism. That held together for quite a long time as the dominant sort of global cultural norm, variably accepted around the world.
Where were they held then? The United Nations?
The United Nations is a great example, yeah,
Okay.
as a kind of illustration of an institution that embodies this, absolutely. But you could also look at the World Bank, you could look at the OECD. These kinds of institutions are manifestations of these principles.
Yeah, my mind goes immediately to my home, the EU.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So these kinds of ideals are increasingly challenged by populism, authoritarianism, nationalism, these trends we read about increasingly.
Yeah, I mean, I used to be 100% EU. Now I have a UK passport. I'm not only from the EU
Brexit
anymore.
is often held up as one of the examples of the kind of breaking up of this prior world order.
Well, Charlotte, with your travel schedule, you need multiple passports. So that's all I can say.
Yeah.
It's too true.
So, you know, the connection between the liberal world order and sustainability, was that addressed in the papers at the conference?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the more interesting ways it came up was in sort of thinking about new ways of how we should understand activism, because we have increasing contexts where that are authoritarian or where there's a lot of repression of civil society. Certainly in some regimes we might know of. So China has increasing restrictions, for example, on all kinds of civil society. But even in Canada, where I'm from, there are increasing restrictions on the activities and funding sources of NGOs, in part because of environmental activism and wanting to stop international influence on what are considered domestic environmental issues. So traditional understandings of activism aren't working as well as they used to. And we need to think about what it means to be an environmental activist in China, for example. So we had one discussion about what that looks like in China and another in the Middle East, of what it looks like to be an environmental activist in Egypt.
What does it look like to be an environmental activist in those places?
It looks very different. So people don't identify as activists. They describe themselves as ambassadors, environmental ambassadors, maybe.
I see.
And the nuance of activity is much more around sort of careful language choice of how a problem is described, is sort of the line of what's considered advocacy or not. So we might not recognize it. It takes a very skilled scholar with deep knowledge of the context to be able to go in, deep ethnography, so on the ground, watching people every day, to be able to identify how what we would call activism is unfolding in these contexts. But it is. It's also important to understand because some of our traditional activism tactics in the environmental realm, which are, you might think of Greenpeace and these disruptive protests, are really counterproductive, is what seemed to come out of studies in those two contexts. The reaction is intense state crackdown and a lack of dialogue in ways that was really harmful to environmental outcomes. So these more subtle ways of having open dialogue and engagement seem to be more effective in those contexts.
So the first thing I immediately want to ask is, do you think there's any point to activism then in places that are so restrictive that, I mean, you said so yourself, it's just word choice. Like, should people even care at that point? Should they just give up? Because, and I think I speak for the youth here when I say, like, I feel like giving up. And the reason that, you know, I even go to a protest is because I'm angry and I want someone to know that I'm angry. Like, yes, I marched out of my school and I ignored my lessons, and sure, you can say that's counterproductive, but yeah.
I do absolutely think it's worthwhile. We can say without question that activism of various kinds or advocacy, including lobbying, so that the wide range of sort of activities that civil society and nonprofit organizations take do matter. So there are studies showing, we had a really interesting one actually about the different kinds of actors in various advocacy work and different kinds of environmental issues. And it really matters. So civil society actors are, in general, sort of more effective in the US on sacred areas of nature. So like protection of the natural world, what we might think of as big species and national parks and beautiful rivers. So the sacred areas of nature, they're very effective. They're less engaged in what we might call the profane areas of nature, like pollution, shaping the EPA. They're just not as engaged as firms are in these areas. That distinction is sort of an old sociological one going back to Durkheim that sort of shapes many areas of society. So for me, it was interesting to see how it matters sort of what areas maybe activism is taking place in, but it does matter.
Well, that's interesting. So, Tricia, you were saying that even in Canada, you're seeing the nature of activism change. And yeah, I wasn't as surprised to hear the findings from China, but Canada.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a global trend. All kinds of countries now of restrictions on especially international sources of funding to domestic nonprofit organizations. Many of them are driven by protests over environmental issues. In the case of Canada and in many other countries, it's largely imagined to be the influence of American foundations and American cultural influence getting involved in the internal operations around whether Canada wants to put a pipeline, for example, an oil pipeline through the country.
I see.
So the idea is American money and activism is coming in and getting in the way of what the government wants to do.
I see. That's very interesting. So now you've run this conference for a number of years now. What was surprising to you out of the different research findings that were reported?
Yeah, so two things really stood out to me this year. One was we had a huge array, very purposefully this year, of different kinds of academic disciplines represented. And it just really sits with me of how valuable that was for understanding our own limitations. So an example is we had a discussion about social innovation. And from one perspective in the audience, that was considered so valuable, the solution, in fact. And Bill, this might actually fit with some of your work of this idea that more innovation is better because we don't know. There are limits to human understanding of what can happen. So more innovation is going to be better. This is a kind of evolutionary view of social change. But from more sort of functional views in the room, the idea is that this is very wasteful and inefficient to be just spurring lots of innovation. Most of it fails. It can be very expensive and wasteful. So
and
maybe
more so, if I could add on, funny that you say this. I'm taking a class right now called Scaling Social Innovation.
Oh, great. Yeah.
Taught by the GSB. And we talk a lot about pilot programs. And that's where you see this failure happen very quickly. And it seems to me just almost wrong by communities to sort of pilot a program and then run out of money and leave and, go back home to Silicon Valley and move on. Or even worse, companies will be for-profit companies and they start off with good intentions and then they make some money and all of a sudden good intentions are gone. And we just call it mission drift. It's...
Yeah, there are certainly ethical issues involved in sort of what kinds of programs you should pilot that might not continue. You wouldn't want to, for example, mess with children's schooling, starting a school for vulnerable children and then shutting it down a year later would be sort of unethical and problematic to do. In some other areas, though, it might be the optimal outcome for the whole system to have more innovation.
Yeah.
So it does sort of depend on what view you're coming from, and the ethical issues cut across all of them.
This is such an interesting conversation. I mean, if you think about it, the presumed alternative or counterfactual here is that the school, for example, would continue.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, just like, I was walking through town the other day and I saw 4 restaurants that went out of business and no one's ever surprised, right? Same with schools, same with lots of things we do where they end up failing even though you didn't want them to fail.
Mm-hmm.
So the only defense I guess I could give to that idea that they're teaching you in your class, Charlotte, is that given that so much of what we do in organizations to try to solve problems is essentially experimental, admitting to it allows us to conduct the experiment in a way that minimizes the downside of that failure for the people who remain. Yeah, because if we don't experiment, it doesn't mean we're not going to fail. It just means the failures will be much more catastrophic, when the changes happen.
I think my collective good Canadian side kind of jumps in with the link to the ethics of absolutely with some minimum threshold, which I'm sure you would see as well.
Sure,
of some basic human needs and rights need to be guaranteed to be protected.
Absolutely. And I think once we start making experiments explicit, then we have to think about the people who are involved in them as human subjects.
Yeah, absolutely.
And all the ethical concerns around that. So I would like to give you the last word, Tricia, to think about what's next for civil society. What do you see in terms of the link between civil society and sustainability in the future?
Ooh, that is a very big question. I think I can answer better what we can do here.
Okay, that's fine.
which I do feel like relates to the larger question. There's a whole lot of mixing across the different sectors, government, civil society, academia, in a much more intensive way. We experimented with that at this conference. That was one of the other very exciting changes we made to the format. So having civil society leaders there engaged in the conference with our scholars helped both sides sort of gain a better sense of how we can do better to solve these problems. So I think we had a really good microcosm and kind of exciting setting for looking at how these sort of transdisciplinary spaces can be useful in that way. And I can see that as a broader future, but certainly it will be what we're working on here as well.
Oh, well, that's fantastic. And Charlotte, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, just reiterating that, really, I think doing everything throughout sectors, really using that multi-sectoral approach, that's the answer at the end of the day. So,
all right. Well, from Charlotte Kramer, from Patricia Bromley, and from me, Bill Barnett, until next time. The Stanford Initiative on Business and Environmental Sustainability podcast series is sponsored by the Stanford Graduate School of Business and the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability. Music by Charged Particles. That's Caleb Hutzler, Mike Rock, and John Krosnick.